Amen. Hey, today is a very, very good day. It is a joy to celebrate the lifelong, actually the word would be eternal decision that all these students have made to either right before this or earlier in life follow Christ. And so today's a really, really good day. If I have not yet had a chance to meet you, my name is John. I am the lead student pastor here, which is a fancy way of saying I'm the old guy on the student team. The reason I know that I'm the old guy is twofold. Number one, at high school camp, Connor and I had very different feelings about how late it was cool to hang out. Like, he'd be like, hey, high school is just like hang out, whatever. We're just going to keep hanging out after midnight, 1 a.m., like whatever. We'll just go with the vibe. And I'm just standing in the back of the room going, I hate you. All I want to do is go to bed. Why are you doing this to me, Connor? I took it personal. The other reason that I know I'm the old guy is some of you probably saw me hobble up here. A couple days ago, I broke my foot. And in true old man fashion, I didn't break it doing anything cool. I broke it going over a fence in my backyard. Like an old man does. That's how I broke my foot. So I'm on the stool today. Hopefully I don't fall off and break anything else. Clearly I cannot be trusted with gravity in any way, shape, or form. And so hopefully this goes well. I got no easy way to segue to this, but if you got a Bible with you, open up to the book of Matthew. Go to the book of Matthew, and if unfamiliar with where Matthew is in the Bible, or if you got it on your phone, you can go there too. Matthew is the first book in the New Testament, and we're going to be in Matthew chapter 5, and where we're going to start is about halfway through chapter 5, which is verse 17. So go to Matthew chapter 5, and go to verse 17. I'm going to have a group of verses that I'm going to read for you this morning, or this afternoon, but before I do that, and I also got no easy way to segue to this story. One of the very interesting things about me is that I am one of the few people that I know of, in fact, I know only about 20 of us that have done this, that have ever played soccer inside a maximum security prison. That's an actual thing that I did in my life, is I have played soccer inside of a maximum security prison. No, I was not there for something that I did. I was not in the maximum security prison. But when I was in college, I was going to school to be a pastor, and I played on our school's soccer team. And so as a ministry, which apparently this was a thing, we had the opportunity to play the inmates at Walla Walla State Penitentiary. And if you know anything about Walla Walla State Penitentiary, if you are there for a reason, and it's not a good one. And so we go and we roll in our van. We pull through the gate, and we're all a bunch of dudes, somewhere around 20 to 23. And so of course we're cracking all kinds of jokes as we're rolling in. Half of them are appropriate, half of them are not. And we're rolling into this prison, and then the head guard hops in the van real quick and kind of gives us the spiel of like, hey, here's what you got to do. Here's how to stay safe. And at one point he just simply goes, oh, and by the way, never leave my side. And we're like, ha. And he goes, no, I'm being serious. Never leave my side. And now it dawns on us like, oh, this is kind of a big deal. And so we walk through the entirety of the prison to where the field is, known as the yard, right? And we're warming up, doing our thing, and then a bell rings, and I kid you not, like ants coming out of an ant farm or coming out of a hill. Like all of a sudden, this bell rings, and hundreds of maximum security inmates come piling in to this makeshift soccer field that they have set up. And not only do they come piling in, but they line the outside of it. And by line the outside of it, I mean there is centimeters between them and the touch line. So if the ball goes out, you're like, all right, I'll let you guys get it. Like, just whenever you're ready, just go ahead and throw it back in. I'm going to be all right over here near the guard. And that's where we played. And so we play this whole game against these prisoners. And oddly enough, the thing that sticks out to me from that day is not just all the funny details, and there's so many more that I have. For the sake of time, I have to condense it. But it was actually one of the things that my coach said. My coach, who was a very British man, by the way, from the city of Manchester, he looks at us and he says, guys, one of the things I need you to consider, and I won't dare do his accent, But he says, one of the things that I need you to consider, as I've heard you laughing and joking and all this stuff, and it was a moment of clarity and wisdom as he was the only old guy, the only one real adult in the van. He looks at us and he says, look, I need you to really consider that these men are in here for doing the very things that you desire in your own heart. And that stuck with us, right? It kind of quieted us down. And sure, the actions that these men had taken are very different from the actions that I'd taken in my own life, but he wasn't wrong. That the very things that they acted upon were things that, to a degree, one way or another, if I'm being very honest, were things that had sat in my own heart one moment or another, or for a long time. And it stuck. And it was a brief moment that maybe, just maybe in action, but in heart and in mind, maybe I wasn't so far off from these guys. And that maybe how Jesus desired me to see myself was a little bit more sober, a little more humble than maybe what I had considered. As a ministry, we've been going through the book of Matthew, and very particularly, we've been going through Jesus' most famous sermon of all time. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. He gave it while he was on a hillside to thousands of people. And really the big idea, or the idea that we've been traveling through this entire series, that Jesus desired to get across to this multitude of people that he was speaking to was really about himself. And the idea that he desired to get across was that to place Jesus on the throne of their life, or to put Jesus as king and lead over our life, what it would mean is it would mean that we would have to surrender. That inevitably it would mean that we would have to surrender to his rule, meaning what he called true. We would have to surrender to his reign, meaning following his lead for our life, and his change that he desired to bring, meaning if there was anything in our life that did not align with what he called good and true and desired, we would actually have to change that thing and bring it under what his rule was. And the way that he did this is by talking about this idea of the kingdom. And it's one of the phrases that Jesus actually uses very often, but most specifically, it's recorded a lot in the book of Matthew, where Jesus talks about this idea of the kingdom. And the kingdom was essentially Jesus' word to be synonymous for those that were his followers, that he was the king of their life. And God's kingdom was really anywhere where his rule was expressed. And it was kind of unlike the other kingdoms of the world that you and I would think of. It wasn't merely an external reality that we see. It was actually something that began internally in a human heart and mind. And then it expressed itself externally. And so the point of it was that God desired that we would enter into his kingdom, meaning that we would be people that would be led by him both in what we do and in what we desire, both in the things that we act upon and the affections of our heart, what our heart longed for, loved, or I would even use the word worships. He desires all, and so he desires both within that. And it's with that backdrop that what I want to do is I want to read from what Jesus says in the book of Matthew, chapter 5, starting in verse 17. We're picking it up kind of about the first third of the Sermon on the Mount, and this is what it says. Starting in verse 17, Jesus says, "Don't think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets." That would be the Old Testament. He says, "I've not come to abolish them." He says, "I've come to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, and until heaven and earth pass away, not one iota, not a dot will pass away from the law until it's all accomplished. And so therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven, or the kingdom of God. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom." Then he says, you've heard it said that to those of old that you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who's angry will be liable to judgment. If you insult your brother, you'll be liable to the council, and whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. And so if you are offering your gift at the altar and there you remember that your brother has something against you, leave it leave your gift there before you go and be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're going with them to court, lest they hand you over to the judge and the guard, and you'll be put into prison. So truly I say to you, you'll never get out until you've paid that last penny. He says, you've also heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, everyone who even looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his very heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it's better for you to lose one of your members than the whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off, throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than the whole body go into hell. He said, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, that everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits it as well. And again, you have heard it said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but you shall perform to the Lord what you've sworn. But I say to you, don't take an oath, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it's his footstool, or by Jerusalem, or for the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Instead, let what you say simply be yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. And so when Jesus says that someone is a person of the kingdom, it's synonymous, right? It's synonymous with a person who has eternal life. It's another way of saying a person who's going to go to heaven. It's a person who is forgiven. It's a person who is saved. It's a person who's right with God. That's a person of God's kingdom, or sometimes it's called the kingdom of heaven as well. And what we see right away is that Jesus is talking about, very surprisingly, who's in and who's not. Who's in the kingdom and who's not. And he's making the point, the really difficult point, that God's standard of who is in the kingdom is irreversibly high, right? Like, he is a holy king, so therefore to be in the kingdom, the standard of getting in is really high, and essentially no one could enter it. We actually sang about it earlier in one of our songs. We called it a mountain that we couldn't climb, but that's actually Jesus' point to begin with. And the first point that we see from this passage is this, is that our trust in Jesus, or if we trust in Jesus, we will measure up. If you and I choose to trust in Jesus, what happens is we measure up. There's this moment where Jesus says to his hearers, it's this last sentence, kind of in the first section, he says, unless your righteousness is greater, use the word surpass, unless it surpasses the scribes and the Pharisees, he says, you're not in. Which, for the original hearers of that statement, it was both shocking and honestly, it was probably pretty disheartening, because the Pharisees and the scribes were known for their righteous deeds. In the Old Testament, there were 613 laws. 613. The reason there were so many is because God intended to make the case to his people that they couldn't keep them. That his standard was so high that they would need him on their behalf to be forgiven of those things. So there's no way anyone would keep them. But the Pharisees took it as a challenge. They're like, 613, got it. And so not only did they do that, but they were so concerned with keeping God's law that they actually added rules on top, bringing the laws that they sought to follow closer to 1,000. No human can do that. And so you could imagine the hearers are looking at Jesus and they're like, what do you mean? How am I going to keep a greater percentage of these laws than the scribes and the Pharisees who have dedicated their life to obedience? Jesus, I cannot measure up to that, and that's his point. But there was also something else that was like shocking in what Jesus was saying. When Jesus said, unless your righteousness surpasses these guys and you're not in, Jesus was inferring as well that they, the scribes and Pharisees, were not in. That would have been a bit of a surprise. Because again, if they assumed anybody would have been in, it would have been these guys. In fact, as we watch over time in the gospel, Jesus' interaction with the scribes and the Pharisees, it is not a positive relationship. It's actually a very combative one, because he continually comes back to them and he says, guys, you're not in. And so that leaves the question then of who is, right? That leaves the question of like, how in the world could I measure up? Because the problem of the Pharisees and the scribes, it wasn't their amount of good things they did, it was their nature. It was that their relationship with God was one that was marked by a sinful mind and heart and life. And through their good deeds, they couldn't earn their way to him. What they needed was to be totally transformed. They needed to be brought from life into death. The whole thing needed to become new, not just add new things into their life. And what was happening was these guys, they couldn't see. It's kind of like what my coach said as we were in the van. They couldn't see that the reality was they had the same heart as those that weren't keeping the rules. See, the person who looks at God's standard and says, I don't care about that, I'm going to go do what I want. And the person that looks at God's standard and goes, oh, I can achieve that. The irony is those two people are actually in the same place. Neither one of them is in a place where they're right with God at all. Because actually what causes us to be in right relationship with God, if you look at the very beginning of Matthew chapter 5, the first line of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he opens with this line, and the line's intentional. The whole sermon builds after this one sentence that Jesus says, and he looks at the crowd and he says, blessed are those who are poor in spirit, because yours is the kingdom of God. Meaning, those that get into the kingdom are those that know that they don't deserve to get into the kingdom. Those who understand their poverty, if you will, their spiritual poverty before God, and go, God, I got nothing. Like, I literally got nothing. I have nothing to bring, nothing to earn. I could never climb the mountain. Like, I got zero. In a twist of God's design, God says those are the people that get in. The people that get in are those that admit their need and then accept the gift that Jesus is offering to be credited to them on their behalf, which is so opposite of how you and I operate, right? Like, that is not how we think. It's not how Jesus' hearers would think. And what that means is, to this day, we've got so many people that still think that all of this is about the good things that you and I do to earn our way to God. But Jesus is making the exact opposite. He says, look at those group of guys over there. They follow over 1,000 laws, and they're trying, and they're not even in. It is not about you and I doing good things to earn our way to God. It is about a good God that comes our way and brings us to himself through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. It is credited to our account as if we had kept all the laws. That's what it means where Jesus says, he says, I've come to fulfill it. Jesus fulfilled it in two ways. Number one, he kept them all. And number two, he was the fulfilled promise. He was the fulfilled promise in the Old Testament of the one that would finally, through him, would our sins be totally forgiven. That trust in him, it would be forever forgiven, and we wouldn't have to keep doing these things in order to be forgiven. Our trust in him would count in our place. That's what Jesus means when he says, I have fulfilled it. And so what this practically means for you and I is that there is not a single person, there's not a single person who's in the kingdom who didn't first enter by admitting their need. That's the door. Just simply the person who admits their need and accepts that it is Jesus who answers it. That is the only door, and it will be the only door forever that we enter into the kingdom of God, that we are saved, that we are righteous, that we are new, that we're right with God, that we're forgiven. It's the only option, because we couldn't do it on our own. The other part that this means really practically for us is that for those that are doing the good things but have never come to God and said, Lord, I can't measure up. I admit that I cannot meet your standard, and so I ask you to meet it in my place. The reality is there's always going to be those of us that especially walk into the doors of a church that still don't understand that still are trying to do it on our own, that we think it's about the good things that we are doing. And we enjoy the blessings of a community like this and people cheering for us and all those things. But maybe, just maybe, we ourselves have never come to God and said, God, I admit that I cannot do it, and I need Jesus to do it for me in my place. That is what makes us new. That's what the Pharisees needed. That's what the people needed. It also means that if you have done that, and here's the best news ever, and this might be worth like the whole price of admission for this morning. If you have done that, it means that you are completely secure. If it is something that God does for us and it is not upon our own effort, it also means that it cannot be taken from us. It cannot be taken from you by you and what you did or you didn't do today, this week, this month. And it cannot be taken by another person. It is given to you by the God of the universe who made everything and made you. He has the authority to give it, and only he would take it, and he promises that he never will. If you have gone before God and God, I admit that I don't have anything. I need you to save me. I can't do it. No matter what happened today, no matter what happened this week, you are secure in him. You are who he says you are. We spent an entire summer camp on that one sentence. You are who he says you are, and I would add, who he says you are through Jesus. That's who you are, and it will always be who you are. And so the first question I think this begs us to ask is have you done this? Have you trusted Jesus in this way, or are you still trying to measure up on your own? Are you still trying to do it on your own? And if we have done that, there's a natural thing, and Jesus kind of progresses, a natural thing that it changes. It also changes what you and I care about. It should change what you and I care about. The second thing we see in this passage is that for a person of the kingdom, what it means is that we care about all of what God says. A person of the kingdom cares about, and the key word there is I would have the three-letter word all. We care about all of what God says. See, when you trust somebody, you care about what they say, not just part of what they say. You care about all of what they say. And so for a second, I want to do an internal experiment in your head. I want you to think of two people, and maybe you can put a face and a name to this. Maybe you can't. Maybe it's just two types of people for you. I want you to think of a person that you do deeply, deeply trust. Give them name, face. Right? We're thinking of a person whom when they say things to you, you believe them. You trust them. And as much as you desire, you do want to act on what they say because, again, you trust them. Now, I want you to think of a person that's the opposite end, someone you do not trust. Whether it's for good reason or bad, you do not trust them. When they say things, you do not believe them. When they say things, you might listen, you might be nice, but certainly you do not act upon what they say. And so my question back would be, which category for you does God fit in? Which one is he? Which one is he? Because if we truly, truly actually do trust God that he is who he says he is and he's done what he says he's done, then one of the ways that naturally just shows up and displays in our life is we do trust and we care about all of the words that he says, right? They all carry weight to them. Right? So one of the ways to tell where our heart is at with God is what we do with his words, not just some of his words, but all of his words. And every parent on the planet, and there's a little extra of us in the room today, knows this move by a kid, and every one of us who has been a child at some point knows that we've done this move. And the move is, I will do about 65% of what my parents ask, right? It's that move. This happened to me the other day, and I know I did this as a kid to my parents, like all the time. But this happened the other day. We were driving along. My second son gets in the car and had 3 requests. And by the way, not all requests have the same weight, but they all matter because of who's saying it, right? In this case, it's dad saying it. And so Rhett's getting in the car, and I'm like, Rhett, I need you to do 3 things. Number 1, you got a bunch of stuff all by your seat, right? Like, he just assumes that the floor is his place to whatever snack he's left over. He's like, this seems reasonable, right? Like every kid ever. And so hey, buddy, I need you to pick up the snack. Number 2, his 2-year-old sister is screaming because he keeps messing with her. Because he's 7, and he's like, well, this is going to be fun. And so that's what he's doing. Number 3, we need to leave. I need you to put your seatbelt on. And so granted, all 3 of those requests are not identical, and they don't all carry equal weight, right, in the moment. But I still need him to do all of the requests. So classic, what does he pick? He picks, just pick up the snacks. That's the only one. It's like, picks up the snacks and is like, I did it, right, Dad? And I'm like, no, that's not what I said. Like, that's part of what I said, but you didn't care about the other 2 things that I said because you wanted to do your own thing. And we are that way with God, right? Even if we say we love God, it's okay for us to humbly admit that our natural disposition is to take his words and go, I'll do like 7/10 of that. Because there's always going to be this moment for us that as God desires to lead our life, he's going to lead us into difficulty. He leads us into things that are hard for us to give up, hard for us to release, hard for us to humbly admit. When Jesus says here, he says, not one iota, not one dot will pass away from God's law. What he means is he's referencing the smallest parts of Hebrew letters. It would be like our dot on an I or our cross on a T. He's saying that everything that God said, everything he said, is worthy and important, and we should care, not just the words, not just the sentences, not just the paragraphs, not even the letters, all the way down to the parts of the letter. And he's being mildly metaphorical, right? All the way down to the parts of the letter matter because it's God who is speaking them. And so the challenge for you and I think the question this begs us to answer out of this is am I taking all of what God is saying, and do I care about all of what he says in his word? Or am I picking and choosing? Right? Are there things that I know that he has said and I just refuse to care about it? Either because I want to do what I want to do or I don't think it's all that important. But if we do really trust him, then it must mean that I care about all that God says. And if I care about all that God says, the natural place that it would lead is not just simply to the affections and the desires that I have, but it would also lead to the spot where I would fully act on what God says. Perhaps the greatest defining characteristic of a person of the kingdom, probably the best one we can see, if you will, is that we fully, again, that's probably the most important word in the sentence, fully act on what God says. Right? So genuine trust in God, it begins at being a person who admits the need, trusts that he counts for us. It means that I care about all of what he says, but then it means I'm also going to act on it. If I truly trust him, I'm going to act on it. And what Jesus does here is in the passage, he gives examples of 4 things, and then Connor's going to teach next week, and Jesus is going to give more examples, but the first 4 that he gives, notice that they all started with the sentence, you've heard it said, and so these were things that people were being taught. So actively, Jesus' hearers are being taught what he quotes. And so he says, you've heard it said, you've heard it said, you've heard it said, but the common denominator between all of the examples that Jesus gives is that all of them were things that people could do on the outside that didn't actually require change on the inside. They were all things that they could do to look a certain way, or a better way to say it was, they were all things that someone could do to, like my son and every kid ever, to partially obey what God is saying, but not take it to its fullest extent. So for example, what was happening is people were, just like it is in our culture, people will go, well, look, I've basically kept God's law because I didn't do the worst of them, right? I didn't kill a guy and I didn't sleep with a man's wife. We're good, right? Like God and I are good. And then the other ones are a little bit harder to discern what was happening in the culture, but what was happening was people could just, again, like in our culture, and it tended to be male to female, tended to be husband to wife in theirs, that husbands could just hand their wives a piece of paper that basically said, we are divorced, and instantaneously, she was out of the family, and she was on her own. And the thought was, well, I filed the paperwork, so God and I are good. And then the last one about oaths is a little bit odd, but what the Pharisees were teaching was a twisting of God's command. What they were saying was, you don't have to keep your promises as long as you don't use God's name in it. So for example, if they promised to do something and say, hey, I promise in God's name that I'll give you $5, they had to do it. Oh, that's what people are being taught. But if they didn't say, I promise in God's name, it was kind of like a spiritual fingers crossed behind the back of going, oh, I don't have to really keep it. And can you see the thread that runs through all of them? All of them are things that are external, and they're all ways of getting out of God's intent for his people. And so as I go through these examples of what Jesus is really saying, here's what's really wise for us as we end. What is really wise for you and I is always to ask the question, where do I see myself in here? Because all of us are in process, right? There's not a person in here, regardless of age, that has arrived, right? None of us are perfect. And so it is wise and humble of us to ask, where do I see myself in here? Because it might be a little bit hard at first, but I don't think it's that hard. Similarly, as I was sitting in that van, the reality is the very things that Jesus is talking about, that it sits in our hearts. And so example one, Jesus is saying that if you and I truly cared about what God had to say, if we truly trusted him, what it would mean is that we would care about physically harming someone, right? That would be wrong. But we would also care about the fact that we mock them and that we cut them with our words. Or even deeper, they never know, but we secretly hate them, despise them, or we really believe that we're better than them. He said, if you really cared, really trusted God, then you would care deeply both about what's on the inside and the outside. He says if you cared, you would even go so far in your actions to ask God's forgiveness for that and his help to change that. And not only would you ask for his forgiveness, but if you knew that something was between you and someone else, you wouldn't wait for them to come to you, you would go to them. And it would be out of a heart of humility that cared about the fact that there was something wrong between you and this other person. If you had conflict, that you would be the first to go and to ask for forgiveness, regardless of what happened in the relationship, you would own your part first. He says, if you really trusted God, if you really cared about what he said, this is a way that it would show up in your life, because it would come from a heart that's willing to fully act on God's words. Or example two, he said, you wouldn't just care about what you do with another person's body, you would also care about how you see another person in your mind and in your heart. You would care that our tendency as human beings is that we selfishly look at another person, not like a person, but we tend to look at them like a thing that exists for our pleasure, a thing to be used rather than a person to honor. And he said, if you really, really, really cared about sin in your life, what you would do is you would run away from it so fast that you would run away from it in such a way that even if it hurt, you would do it. And as Jesus says, gouge out an eye, cut off a hand, he means it metaphorically, but he's saying, in essence, even if it went to that extent, you would die to those things to get rid of it in your life. And there are going to be those of us in this room, and very particularly in the battle that Jesus is referencing, very particularly, he references the battle against lust. And this particular struggle has a unique flavor to it. And I think it's wise that he references this to say that particularly in this battle, but it's also true in others, that our tendency is to do half measures. Our tendency is to only go half of the way in dealing with it. And so we might do something like, for example, we might be in a life group here in HSM, and we might admit, hey, I got to battle with this. And we go and we pray, and it feels like relief, because it does, right? Being honest and vulnerable is a good thing. It's what God commands, and it's hard to do. But so often we will be honest and vulnerable, or we'll admit to someone what's going on, and then we stop. And that's where we stop. We don't take the next step to really do anything about it. Right? Like, for example, if I struggle with looking at things, it might practically mean that I get rid of my phone. I apparently cannot be trusted with a smartphone. I got to go over to the store and buy a dumb phone that does texting, maybe calling, and kind of works sometimes. But Jesus' point is, how far are you willing to go? Do you love having a smartphone more than you love being free from lust? And the answer for so many of us is yes. Or do you love being in this romantic relationship more than being free from lust? And the answer so many of us is yes, I love this more than what Jesus is commanding me to. And one of the things that we got to humbly admit, and I got to humbly admit this, and again, any person who's ever been in charge of any human being knows this, half obedience is still disobedience. It's not the full thing. And there's going to be those of us in this room that God is inviting you and I to be free, like truly, fully free from the battles that we are facing. But what it's going to mean is to fully obey him. And that's hard to do. And we will never be free until we are willing to fully do that. And then, for the first time, true freedom from what we struggle with is possible through him. Example 3, There's no high schooler in here that, as far as I'm aware of, has divorced a spouse. I hope not. That's not describing any high school student here. But if you and I care about human relationships, then what that means is that, and this includes marriage, right, that we would see it as one day sacred, that we see our relationships as sacred. It means that we do not discard people because it got difficult or we have to work something through or they hurt us. See, caring about what God says means that we would always be people that seek reconciliation first, that it's always our first response to conflict between us and someone else. If you and I really cared about God's words, example 4, we wouldn't just care about the obvious outward things that people can see. What we would also care about is all the little things we say, all the little ways that we make promises that we don't keep, all the little things that we half commit to, all the little things that we give the impression that we'll be there, but then we flake. See, our natural tendency as a human being is to see those as not a big deal, but again, they come from the God who saved us and loves us, created us, so therefore it is. And what Jesus is trying to get across is that if you truly care about my words, then it will flow into every part of your life, both the really, really big, cavernous rooms of your life, and also the tiny little spaces as well. And I will also say, and I think something that I've learned, is that to some degree, it can be easier to invite Jesus into the big cavernous spaces, the obvious ones. And over time, it can be harder and harder to invite him into the little ones because we just tend to ignore them.